In this section, we will learn about control flow statements and loops in Python. First, we will learn about the if, elif, and else statements and how to work with them in Python. After that, we will learn about working with for loops. Next, we will learn about working with while loops. Then we will learn about the break keyword and the role that it plays in controlling code execution in Python. After that, we will look at the continue keyword and gain an understanding of the role it plays in controlling code execution. Then we will learn about Python's range function. After that, we will learn about using an else statement when working with loops. Finally, we will have some hands-on coding exercises to test your knowledge of the material you learned in this section of the course. In the next lecture, we will learn about Python's if, elif, and else statements. In this lecture, we will learn about using the if, elif, and else control flow statements in Python. Remember that conditions can evaluate to the Boolean values true or false. We can use these values, true and false, to determine which branch of code out of several possibilities gets executed. The advantage that this gives us is that we can write code that will handle the logic for all possible outcomes, and then based on a Boolean value, the proper code block will handle that condition. We already looked at a basic overview of these statements in an earlier lecture. Now we are going to deep dive into them in this video. Recall that an if statement will execute if the condition specified for it evaluates to true. For example, we can check if 3 is less than 5, and if so, print a message to the console. When we run this code, we will notice that the message was output to the console since 3 is less than 5. For the next example, let's flip this if statement around. We will check the condition that 5 is less than 3, which of course we know is false. Now we will run the code again. This time, we will notice that the message was not printed to the console. Another control flow statement that we have access to in Python is the Elif statement. Elif is a way of checking another condition in the case that the if statement was false and the body of code inside of the if statement did not execute. For example, if 5 is not less than 3, we can check another condition, perhaps that 2 is less than 4. Now if we run the code, you will notice that the message in the if statement was not printed since its condition is false, but the message from the elif statement was logged to the console. This is because 2 is less than 4. In an if-elif block, we can have one if statement, but we can have any number of elif statements that you want. Let's change the condition of the elif statement to be if 4 is less than 2, so that it is false. Now we can add another elif statement as part of the if-elif code block that we have here. For example, this elif statement could check if 1 is equal to 0. Of course, we know that this will evaluate to false, so the code inside of it will not be printed when the code is run. Also note that, out of the if and elif statements, only one can execute. So if the if statement is true, the elif code is not run. If the if statement is false, but the first elif is true, it will execute, but then not the elif below it. That is one really important concept of if-else-if code blocks. Even if one of the below statements are true, they will not be executed if an if or elif statement above them is true. For example, let's comment out the code we have been working on so we can refer to it in a moment, and type another quick example. In this case, we will have an if statement checking if 1 is less than 2. Then we will have an elif statement checking if 2 is less than 3. When we run this code, you will notice that the code inside of the if statement was hit, but not the code inside of the elif statement. Why is this? Shouldn't both messages have been printed to the console? No. The first if or elif statement will execute, and then the rest of the conditions in that code block will be skipped. Note that if we changed the elif statement to another if statement and ran the code, both of the messages will be printed to the console. This is because the second if statement starts a second code block. It is completely separate from the first if statement. A code block starts with an if statement and continues with any elif statements and an else statement if they follow it. The moment we have another if statement, a new code block has been started, and then the same rules apply for any elif or else statements that go with that if statement. If the if statement is false and all elif statements below it are false, there is a control flow statement that we can use called the else statement that will execute no matter what. Unlike the if and elif statements, we do not supply a condition to the else statement. This is because it executes no matter what if the code gets to that point, meaning that none of the if or elif checks were true. At this point, let's delete the example code that we just worked on and uncomment out the other example. All of the if and elif conditions are false in this example, so we could add an else statement at the bottom. When we run the code, you will notice that the else statement was hit, as the message else statement was hit was printed to the console. So why do we use if, elif, and else statements in the code? We use them because they allow us to control the flow of the code execution. However, there is a disadvantage to using if, elif, and else statements. Their weakness is that if there are many alternative blocks of code to be executed, the code can quickly become spaghetti code and get harder to read and manage. We can also nest if, elif, and else statements inside of each other. Let's look at an example of this. Say we have an if statement that checks if 1 is less than 2. Inside of the if statement, we will have an if-else statement. We will say if false, print if statement was hit. Else, print else statement was hit. Okay, let's run the code. First, the if statement checks if 1 is less than 2. Since 1 is less than 2, the code inside of it is executed. We then come to the if-else statement. The condition for the if statement is false, so the else statement is executed. The message else statement was hit was printed to the console. In the next lecture, we will learn about working with for loops in Python. In this lecture, we will learn about for loops and how to work with them in Python. There are times in programming when we want to execute code multiple times. Let's say we wanted to print hello world to the console 5 times. Using the knowledge that we know so far, our option would be to actually write 5 lines of code, 1 for every time we want to print to the console. But this takes a lot of unnecessary effort and can be time consuming. Also, if we want to change the text being printed, we would have to change the text on all 5 of these lines. In a situation where we know the amount of times we want a block of code to repeat, we can use a control flow statement called the for loop. Let's rewrite this code in the syntax of a for loop. The first step is to use the for keyword. Then we will type I in range. The range function takes in 3 values: start, stop, and step. We will start at 0, stop at 5, and increment by 1 each time. Note that this for loop will execute for the values 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, as it will go up to but not including the stop value. At the end of the line comes a colon. Then comes a print statement to print hello world, indented inside of the for loop. This for loop will tell the computer to print out hello world 5 times. We will break down the code we typed in a moment, but first let's run the code. As you can see, the phrase hello world was printed to the console 5 times. This for loop was able to execute the code inside of it 5 times. Why was that? The key is the 3 statements that come inside of the parentheses of the range function. The first number, 0, is the starting value. The second number, 5, is the stop value. The third number, 1, is the value to increment I by on each successive iteration of the for loop. So I starts out with a value of 0, increases each time the loop is run, and runs while I is less than 5. So the code will run as I equals 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is a total of 5 times. Hence, we get 5 hello world statements logged to the console. When a for loop is executing, each time it is executed is called an iteration. Let's look at another example of how we can use a for loop in Python. This time we are going to write a for loop that will take any string and print the letters out one by one to the console. To start out, let's create a variable named example. We can give it any string we want and the code will work because we are going to write some code that is generic enough to apply to any string. In this example, I will give our variable a value of ABC. Then comes our for loop. We will specify for I in range and start at 0, stop at the length of example, and step by 1 each time. Inside of the for loop, we will print out example at index I. When we run the code, you will notice that A, B, and C were logged to the console. When we iterate over a for loop, it does not have to go forwards. We can also iterate backwards. Let's modify our current example to print out the letters to the console in reverse order. We will start I out at the length of example -1. Recall that the elements in our string are indexed 0, 1, and 2, since indexing in Python starts at 0. The length of the string example is 3, so it would be invalid to reference example at index 3 because there is no element at that index. The second argument of our range function is -1, which means that our for loop will iterate starting at any length of example -1 backwards down to 0. The third value, the step value, will be -1. Now when we run the code, you will notice that the letters were printed in reverse order to the console, in the order C, B, A. It is also possible to nest for loops. This is when we have a for loop inside of another for loop. The first for loop will start out with I at 0, execute while I is less than 5, and then increment I by 1 each time. The second for loop will start out at j equals 0, execute while j is less than 5, and increment j by 1 each time. Inside of the second for loop, we will print the value of I and j each time. What do you think will happen when we run this code? Okay, I'll ask a better question. Pause the video and write down how many times you think the first for loop will run. Then write down how many times you think the second for loop will run. Then run the code. Are the results as you expected? Note that the first for loop ran 5 times. The second for loop ran 25 times. We can tell this because each time I changed values, all of the values of j, 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 were printed. When you have a for loop nested inside of another for loop, the inner loop will execute for all of the iterations, and then the outer loop will execute its next iteration. So every one iteration of the outer for loop resulted in 5 iterations of the inner loop. To recap, here are the key points that we learned about for for loops. A for loop is used to execute a block of code repeatedly when we know the number of needed iterations or times that the code inside of the loop needs to be executed. Also, we can nest loops in Python. In the next lecture, we will learn about while loops and how to work with them in Python. In this lecture, we will learn about while loops and how to work with them in Python. A while loop executes the code inside of it as long as a specified condition is true. Whereas a for loop is best used when we know the number of times we want to execute the code inside of it, a while loop is used when we want to execute the code over and over again, but we are not sure how many times this needs to happen. The syntax is to use the while keyword, then specify the condition, after which comes a colon, and then to have the code indented under that line as the body of the while loop. For this example, let's create a variable named example and set it equal to a value of 0. Then we will have a while loop that will execute while example is less than 3. Inside of the while loop, we will convert example to a string and print it to the console. Then we will increment example by 1 using the plus equals operator. When we run the code, you will notice that the values 0, 1, and 2 were printed to the console. Here is a flowchart showing the flow of execution for a while loop. While the condition is true, the code inside of the while loop is executed. If the condition becomes false, then the code in the while loop stops executing. Key points to remember when working with while loops in Python are that the while loop, just like other loops in Python, is used to execute code repeatedly. The while loop includes a condition expression that has to evaluate to either true or false, or we will get an error when we run the code. Any incrementing or decrementing related to the condition should be done inside of the loop. Also note that just like the other programming constructs that we learned about, while loops can be nested. In the next lecture, we will learn about Python's break keyword. In this lecture, we will learn about Python's break keyword. The break keyword allows us to terminate the execution of a for loop or a while loop. Let's take a look at an example of how we can use the break keyword in action. We will start out with a for loop for I in range 5. Inside of the for loop, we will print hello world. Then we will check if I equals 1. If so, we will break from the for loop. Let's take a second to understand what we just typed. First, we asked Python to print out hello world to the console 5 times. However, we are also telling Python to break from the for loop once it gets to 1. Let's see the result when we run our code. As you can see, hello world was printed twice to the console. The variable I starts out at a value of 0, and hello world is printed. Then we check if 0 equals 1, which of course is false, so we go to the next iteration of the for loop. This time our variable I is equal to 1. Hello world is printed to the console. Then we check if I equals 1. Since it does, the for loop is terminated, even though technically it was supposed to execute 3 more times. That is a look at how we can use Python's break keyword to terminate the execution of a loop. In the next lecture, we will learn about Python's continue keyword. In this lecture, we will learn about Python's continue keyword. Whereas the break keyword terminates execution of the loop, the continue keyword will skip the current iteration and move directly on to the next iteration of the loop. I realize the sentence I just said might be a bit confusing, so let's gain an understanding through a hands-on example. To start out, we will have a for loop for I in range 5. Then we will check if I equals 2. If so, we will continue. Then outside of the if statement, but still inside of the loop, we will cast I to a string, and then print it to the console. Let's run the code. You will notice that 0, 1, 3, and 4 were printed to the console. Notice that 2 was skipped. As soon as the if check evaluated to true and the continue statement was hit, the for loop jumped to the next iteration without executing the code below the continue statement. Essentially, this is what the continue statement does. It ignores the rest of the loop and moves us right along to the next iteration. In the next lecture, we will learn about Python's range function.